On the morning of May 24, 1941, the largest warship in the Royal Navy exploded and disappeared beneath the surface of the Denmark Strait in under 3 minutes, taking 415 men to the bottom of the North Atlantic and leaving only 3 survivors clinging to wreckage in freezing water. The ship that destroyed her was on its very first operational mission, had been at sea for less than a week, and would itself be lying on the ocean floor just 72 hours later. In those few violent days, between the sinking of HMS Hood and the destruction of the ship that killed her, the Royal Navy launched the largest naval pursuit in its modern history, pulling warships from convoy escorts across the Atlantic, diverting forces from the Mediterranean and throwing everything it had into a single obsessive hunt for one German battleship. That ship was the Bismarck, and what makes her story so extraordinary is not simply the damage she inflicted or the fear she inspired, but the fact that the most powerful battleship Germany ever built accomplished all of this and was destroyed in what amounted to a single catastrophic voyage that lasted 9 days from departure to destruction. No warship in the 20th century had a shorter operational life relative to the sheer scale of panic it created across an entire navy. The Bismarck was not just a warship, she was a statement of intent, a calculated provocation built in steel, and her story reveals something unsettling about the nature of naval power itself, that a single ship, in the right circumstances,
the current U-boat activity in this sector is unacceptable.
Over the sea.
We must reroute the HX convoy immediately to avoid further losses.
You have to go back to the moment that made her construction both necessary and inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919. When Germany signed the armistice that ended the First World War, the terms imposed on her navy were deliberately humiliating. The once mighty Imperial German Navy, which had challenged British supremacy at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, was effectively dismantled. Germany was forbidden from building warships exceeding 10,000 tons. She was allowed no submarines. She could maintain only a handful of aging pre-dreadnought battleships and a small number of light cruisers and destroyers, enough for coastal defense and nothing more. The message was clear and deliberate. Germany would never again be permitted to challenge British dominance of the seas. For the men who had served in the Kaiser's navy and who now found themselves officers in the tiny Reichsmarine of the Weimar Republic, the restrictions were not just military limitations, but a national humiliation that shaped everything they did for the next 2 decades. Every design decision, every tonnage
the resistance
calculation,
at high speed is still too high,
every clever engineering workaround that followed was driven by the desire to build as much fighting power as possible within
this section of the armor belt is
beyond
critical.
The boundaries
we must ensure the thickness here can withstand the projected impact
of this
forces.
Impulse came in the late 1920s and early 1930s with the Deutschland-class ships, which the British press immediately nicknamed pocket battleships. These were an ingenious attempt to create something that did not fit neatly into existing categories. At just over 12,000 tons, already slightly above the Versailles limit, though Germany claimed otherwise, they carried 6 11-inch guns that could outshoot any cruiser afloat, while diesel engines gave them an extraordinary range of over 10,000 nautical miles, enough to raid merchant shipping across the entire Atlantic without refueling. They were too fast for most battleships and too heavily armed for most cruisers, a deliberate headache for the Royal Navy's strategic planners, who suddenly had to account for commerce raiders that could strike almost anywhere and then vanish before a superior force could respond. The pocket battleships were clever, but they were also a compromise born of restriction. What the German naval leadership really wanted was something far larger, something that could stand in a battle line and fight the Royal Navy on something approaching equal terms. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the restrictions began to fall away. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 was the diplomatic instrument that changed everything. Under its terms, Britain agreed to allow Germany to build a surface fleet up to 35% of Royal Navy tonnage, with the option of parity in submarine construction. For the British, it was an attempt at managed accommodation. Better to have Germany building within agreed limits than in secret with no limits at all. For the Germans, it was a license to build warships.
This silhouette here represents the new battlecruiser design.
The
We require
Kriegsmarine's
approval to
leadership,
begin immediate
now under the
construction
command
if
of
we are to meet
Admiral
the
Erich
Führer's
Raeder,
timeline.
began planning a new generation of capital ships that would represent everything the Versailles Treaty had tried to prevent. The first of these was to be a battleship of unprecedented size for the German Navy, a ship that would carry the heaviest armor, the largest guns, and the most advanced fire control systems German engineering could produce. She would be built not for coastal defense or commerce raiding, but for direct confrontation with the most powerful navy on Earth. Her keel was laid on July 1st, 1936, at the Blom und Voss shipyard in Hamburg. And from the moment the first steel plate was riveted into place, she was designed to be a ship that the Royal Navy could not afford to ignore. The shipyard that built the Bismarck was itself a monument to industrial ambition. Blom und Voss had been constructing warships on the south bank of the Elbe since the 1870s, and by the mid-1930s, it was one of the largest and most technically advanced shipbuilding facilities in Europe. The construction of a battleship of this scale required not just skilled labor, but an entire industrial ecosystem. Steel mills rolling armor plate to specifications that pushed the limits of metallurgy, foundries casting gun beams that had to withstand pressures measured in tens of thousands of pounds per square inch, electrical workshops producing miles of cabling, and optical firms grinding the lenses for rangefinders that would need to measure distances of 20 miles or more with precision measured in meters. The workforce that built the Bismarck numbered in the thousands, and the construction timeline stretched over nearly 3 years from keel laying to launch. During that time, the hull took shape on the slipway in a process that combined the precision of engineering with the brute physicality of heavy industry. Cranes swinging multi-ton armor plates into position, riveters working in conditions of deafening noise and extreme heat, welders crawling through confined spaces to join structural members that would need to withstand the shock of 15-inch shells striking the hull at velocities approaching half a mile per second. When the Bismarck was launched on February 14, 1939, the ceremony was attended by Adolf Hitler himself, and the ship was christened by Dorothea von Löwenfeld, the granddaughter of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the 19th century statesman who had unified Germany and whose name the ship now carried. The symbolism was unmistakable and deliberately chosen. Bismarck, the man, had built the German Empire through a combination of diplomacy, strategic brilliance, and carefully calibrated aggression. The battleship that bore his name was intended to embody the same qualities, a weapon so powerful that its mere existence would reshape the strategic calculations of Germany's enemies. The launch itself was a spectacle of industrial theater, the massive hull sliding down the greased slipway and into the waters of the Elbe, while crowds of shipyard workers and invited dignitaries watched from the docks. But launching was only the beginning. The hull that entered the water that day was an empty shell, and it would take another 18 months of fitting out, installing engines, armor, weapons, fire control systems, crew quarters, and the thousands of smaller systems that turn a hull into a functioning warship before the Bismarck was ready for war. The ship that emerged from that process was, by any measure, one of the most formidable warships ever built. Her overall length was just over 251 meters, roughly 823 feet, which made her longer than any battleship then in service with the Royal Navy. Her beam was 36 meters, giving her a wide, stable platform that would prove remarkably steady in heavy seas. Fully loaded, she displaced approximately 300 tons, which made her significantly heavier than the 35. Zolltrotten limit that international treaties theoretically imposed on battleship construction, a discrepancy that the German government quietly concealed from the British, declaring her the treaty limit, when in reality she exceeded it by more than 15,000 tons. That concealment was itself a measure of how seriously the Kriegsmarine took the advantage that additional displacement could buy. Every extra ton meant thicker armor, more powerful machinery, greater range or more ammunition. And in a naval engagement, any one of those factors could be the difference between victory and destruction. Her main armament consisted of 8 38-centimeter guns, each with a barrel length of nearly 19 meters, mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward, designated Anton and Bruno, and 2 aft, designated Caesar and Dora. These guns could hurl an armor-piercing shell weighing approximately 800 kilograms to a range of over 36 kilometers, and the fire control system that directed them was among the most sophisticated in the world. The system integrated data from multiple optical rangefinders, including a massive 10-meter stereoscopic rangefinder mounted on top of the foretop, with mechanical analog computers that continuously calculated firing solutions based on the ship's own speed and heading, the target's estimated speed and heading, wind, air temperature, barrel wear, and even the rotation of the Earth. In practice, this meant that the Bismarck could open fire at ranges where the target was barely visible to the naked eye, and land shells with a degree of accuracy that would prove devastating in combat. The secondary armament was equally formidable. 12 15-centimeter guns for use against smaller warships and aircraft at closer ranges, 16-10. 5-centimeter heavy anti-aircraft guns, 16-3. 7-centimeter medium anti-aircraft guns, and a number of 2-centimeter light anti-aircraft weapons that could fill the sky with a curtain of steel fragments designed to shred the fabric-covered biplanes and light bombers of the era. But it was the Bismarck's armor that truly set her apart. The German naval architects who designed her protection scheme drew on lessons learned from Jutland and from extensive post-war analysis of how shells actually penetrated warship armor under combat conditions. The result was a protective system that prioritized the areas most critical to the ship's ability to fight and survive. The main belt, the thick band of armor running along the waterline that protects the ship's vitals from incoming shells, was 320 millimeters thick, composed of crop-cemented armor, especially hardened steel, that combined a very hard outer face capable of shattering incoming shells with a tougher, more ductile backing layer that absorbed the energy of fragments that penetrated the face. The main armored deck, which protected against plunging fire at long range, was between 80 and 120 millimeters thick depending on location.
Lower away,
and the
slowly.
turrets were protected by up to 360 millimeters of armor on their faces,
Get those bolts
thick enough to
secure
resist
now.
hits from virtually any gun then in service. The overall protection scheme was designed to create what naval architects call an armored citadel, a heavily protected box enclosing the ship's magazines, engine rooms, boilers, and fire control spaces, surrounded by less critical areas that could absorb damage without threatening the ship's ability to fight. It was a design philosophy that would be tested to its absolute limits in the final hours of the Bismarck's life, and in some ways it worked exactly as intended.
Look at the steam
The ship
pressure on the
proved
starboard
extraordinarily
side.
difficult to sink, even
It's
under
fluctuating
the
too
most
much.
extreme
Adjusting the
punishment.
regulator
The
now.
propulsion system was built around 12 high-pressure Wagner boilers, feeding steam to 3 sets of Blohm-Voss geared turbines, each driving one of the ship's 3 propeller shafts. The combined output was approximately 150 Caesar-Zone shaft horsepower, enough to push the Bismarck's 50,000 tons through the water at a maximum speed of just over 30 knots, roughly 56 kilometers per hour, which made her one of the fastest battleships in the world at the time of her commissioning. That speed was not simply a performance statistic, it was a tactical weapon. A battleship that could make 30 knots, could choose when and where to engage, could run down slower merchant ships and their escorts, and could disengage from a superior force if the tactical situation turned unfavorable. Combined with a range of approximately 870 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 19 knots, the Bismarck had the endurance to operate across the entire North Atlantic.
Watch the line,
The
lads.
lifeline that connected Britain to the resources and
Steady on, bring
reinforcements
it
of
down.
North America, and the sea lane whose security was the single most critical strategic requirement of the entire British war effort. The ship was commissioned into the Kriegsmarine on August 24, 1940, under the command of Kapitän zur See Ernst Lindemann, a career naval officer who had served in the First World War as a young cadet and who was widely regarded as one of the most capable ship commanders in the German Navy. Lindemann was a reserved, meticulous professional who ran his ship with calm authority and who inspired genuine loyalty and confidence in his crew. The crew itself numbered approximately 92 officers and men at full complement, and they spent the months following commissioning working up the ship in the Baltic Sea. A grueling process of training exercises, gunnery drills, speed trials, and damage control simulations
Mate!
designed
Halte
to
das Schott!
transform a
Rutscht!
collection of
Es
individuals
rutscht!
into a functioning warship crew,
Schlag die Keile
capable of
fest!
operating their enormously complex machine under the stress of combat. The Baltic was ideal for this purpose. Sheltered from the open ocean's worst weather, far from the reach of British bombers, and deep enough for realistic torpedo defense exercises. During these months, the Bismarck's crew fired her main guns for the first time, tested her radar systems against cooperative targets, practiced the intricate choreography of damage control, sealing compartments, fighting fires, shoring up damaged bulkheads, and gradually developed the kind of instinctive coordination that only comes from repetition under realistic conditions. While the Bismarck worked up in the Baltic, the strategic context that would define her operational career was taking shape across the Atlantic. By early 1941, Britain was engaged in a desperate struggle to keep her sea lanes open against the combined threat of German U-boats, surface raiders, and long-range aircraft. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single engagement, but a continuous grinding campaign fought across millions of square miles of ocean. And in the spring of 1941, it was reaching a critical phase. U-boats operating in wolf packs were sinking merchant ships faster than British and American shipyards could replace them. The pocket battleship Admiral Scheer had completed a 5-month raiding cruise that sank 16 ships totaling over 99,000 tons. The battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had sorted into the Atlantic in early 1941 and sunk or captured 22 merchant ships in 2 months. Each of these raiders forced the Royal Navy to divert warships from other duties, to hunt them down, or to provide heavy escorts
The North
for convoys,
Atlantic gap remains
a
our
drain on
greatest
resources
vulnerability,
that the British could
We
ill
simply
afford
don't have the
when they were
escorts, Captain, not
simultaneously
with the
fighting in the
Mediterranean
Mediterranean,
demands.
defending against the threat of invasion, and trying to maintain a blockade of continental Europe. Into this already dire situation,
The breakout will
Kriegsmarine
commence here in
proposed
the
to insert
Baltic,
its most powerful
proceeding
weapon.
north through the
The
Denmark
operation was
Strait
codenamed
into the
Rheinboom,
Atlantic.
Exercise Rhine, and its concept was as ambitious as it was dangerous. The Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, would break out into the North Atlantic through one of the passages between Greenland, Iceland, and the British Isles. And once in the open ocean, the two ships would separate and attack Allied convoys independently. The Bismarck's role was not primarily to sink merchant ships herself, though she could do so if the opportunity arose, but to engage and destroy the convoy escorts, particularly the older battleships and cruisers that the Royal Navy used to protect its most important convoys. With the escorts eliminated, the Prinz Eugen and cooperating U-boats could then attack the unprotected merchantmen at leisure. The strategic logic was sound in theory. If the Bismarck could destroy even 1 or 2 capital ships while simultaneously sinking merchant tonnage, the Royal Navy would be forced into an impossible dilemma, needing to strengthen convoy escorts while simultaneously hunting the raider, stretching already thin resources to the breaking point. Admiral Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, approved the operation, and the man chosen to command the task force at sea was Admiral Günther Lutyens, the fleet commander who had successfully led the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau on their Atlantic raid earlier that year. Lutyens was a complex figure whose personality and decisions would shape every critical moment of the Bismarck's first and final voyage. He was a thoroughly professional officer, technically skilled, personally brave, and deeply committed to the Kriegsmarine's institutional traditions. But he was also cautious by temperament, inclined to follow orders literally rather than exercise independent initiative, and haunted by a realistic assessment of the odds his ships faced against the full weight of the Royal Navy.
Wir können die Bismarck und Tirpitz nicht gleichzeitig riskieren. Das Risiko ist zu hoch. Wir müssen warten.
Which would have given him 2 battleships instead of 1, and dramatically improved his chances of both breaking out into the Atlantic and surviving any engagement with British capital ships. He also wanted the Scharnhorst to join the sortie, but she was undergoing repairs and was unavailable. Raeder overruled him on both counts, insisting that the operation proceed with the forces available. Lutyens accepted the decision with the discipline expected of a senior officer.
He carries the weight of the fleet.
Sensed a fatalism in his manner
The
during the
weather
days
is
before
worsening.
departure that suggested he understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly how narrow his margin for error would be. The Bismarck and Prince
Leinen
Eugen
sind los.
departed
Volle
Gottenhafen,
Kraft voraus.
the German
Kurs
name for the
Ostsee.
Polish port of Gdynia on the Baltic coast, on May 18, 1941, heading north through the Kattegat and into the Norwegian Sea. The route was chosen to keep the ships as far as possible from British air reconnaissance during the transit, using the length of Norway as a shield against detection from the east, while staying outside the normal patrol range of British aircraft, operating from Scotland and Iceland. The weather cooperated initially. Overcast skies and low cloud kept the ships hidden from above, but the passage through the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden was observed by Swedish naval vessels, and the intelligence reached the British Admiralty through diplomatic channels almost immediately. The first link in the chain that would lead to the Bismarck's destruction was forged not by radar or reconnaissance aircraft, but by neutral observers who happened to be watching the right stretch of water at the right moment. The two German ships put into Grimstad Fjord near Bergen, on the Norwegian coast on May 21st, ostensibly to refuel the Prinz Eugen and wait for weather conditions that would favor an undetected passage through the gap between Iceland and the coast of Greenland, the Denmark Strait, the most direct route into the open Atlantic. It was here that the second critical piece of intelligence reached the British. A reconnaissance Spitfire from the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command, flying a routine sweep of Norwegian waters, photographed the two warships at anchor. The photographs were developed and analyzed with urgent speed, and within hours the Admiralty knew that the Bismarck was at sea.
Signal the home fleet immediately. All available resources are to converge on this position.
The Bismarck was the single most dangerous surface threat the Royal Navy faced, and if she reached the open Atlantic, the consequences for the convoy system could be catastrophic. The response was immediate and massive, a reflection not just of the Bismarck's actual capabilities, but of the psychological weight that her name and reputation carried within the corridors of British naval power. Admiral Sir John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet based at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, ordered his available forces to sea. The battlecruiser HMS Hood, at 48,000 tons and 860 feet in length, the largest warship in the Royal Navy, and a ship that had served as the visible symbol of British naval power for over 2 decades, was dispatched under the command of Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, accompanied by the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales. The Hood was fast, beautiful and famous, but she was also more than 20 years old, and her design reflected the priorities of an earlier era. As a battlecruiser,
as you can
she had
see
been
here,
built
the
to
deck
combine the
armor was
firepower of a
woefully
battleship
thin
with the
compared
speed
to the
of a
heavy
cruiser.
belt. This
But
was the
compromise
fundamental
that made this
compromise of the
possible
battlecruiser concept.
was thinner armor than a true battleship carried, particularly on her decks, which were vulnerable to shells falling at steep angles from long range. The Royal Navy was aware of this vulnerability, and plans to modernize the Hood's protection had been drawn up repeatedly. But the demands of wartime operations had never allowed her to be taken out of service long enough for the work to be completed. She went to sea against the Bismarck with the same armor she had carried when she was launched in 1918. The Prince of Wales, by contrast, was so new that she had been commissioned only weeks earlier and still had civilian workers from Vickers Armstrong aboard, trying to resolve persistent mechanical problems with her main armament. The 10 14-inch guns mounted in 2 quadruple turrets and 1 twin turret that represented the latest in British naval gunnery. The quadruple turrets were a complex and relatively untried design, and during the working up period, they had suffered repeated mechanical failures that left individual guns inoperable at unpredictable moments. Sending her into battle in this condition was a calculated risk that reflected the urgency of the situation. The Admiralty judged that even a partially functional Prince of Wales was better than letting the Hood face the Bismarck alone. It was a decision that would have consequences measured in human lives within a matter of hours. Meanwhile, Tovey himself sailed from Scapa Flow in his flagship, the battleship HMS King George V, accompanied by the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious and a screen of cruisers and destroyers, positioning himself to intercept the Bismarck if she attempted to break out through the passage between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, rather than through the Denmark Strait. The cruisers HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk were already on patrol in the Denmark Strait, their crews enduring the miserable conditions of that narrow, ice-choked passage between Greenland and Iceland. Fog, freezing spray, and the constant danger of drifting ice that could damage a hull as effectively as any torpedo. It was Suffolk, equipped with a new Type 284 radar set, that first detected the Bismarck as she entered the Denmark Strait on the evening of May 23rd. The radar return was unmistakable. A large ship moving at high speed through the narrowing gap between the Greenland ice pack and the British-laid minefields off the northwest coast of Iceland. Suffolk reported the contact, and the pursuit that would consume the next 4 days had officially begun.
Right,
Vice Admiral
navigator,
Holland,
new course
aboard the
020.
Hood, received Suffolk's
Intercept bearing
contact reports
340.
and immediately shaped
All available
course to
speed
intercept.
immediately.
His plan was to close the range as quickly as possible, bringing the Hood and Prince of Wales into action at a distance where the Hood's relatively thin deck armor was less vulnerable to plunging fire. At shorter ranges, shells travel on a flatter trajectory and strike the side armor rather than the deck, and the Hood's belt armor was thick enough to offer reasonable protection against hits on the broadside. The problem was the geometry of the approach. To close the range quickly, Holland chose to approach the German ships almost head-on, which meant that for the critical minutes as the range closed, only the forward turrets of both British ships could bear on the target. This effectively halved the weight of their opening broadsides, 4 guns firing instead of 8 on the Hood, and 6 instead of 10 on the Prince of Wales, assuming all guns were functional, which on the Prince of Wales they were not. The two forces sighted each other in the grey light of the Arctic dawn on May 24, 1941, at approximately 05:52 in the morning. The sea was moderate, visibility was good despite overcast skies, and the temperature was near freezing. The Hood and Prince of Wales approached from the southeast, the Bismarck and Prince Eugen from the north. The 4 ships closing at a combined speed that ate away the distance between them
Prince
at nearly
Eugen.
a mile per minute.
Correct to Prince Eugen.
Holland initially
New bearing
misidentified the
340.
lead German
Range
ship
12,000
as the Bismarck.
yards.
It was in fact the Prince Eugen, which had taken the lead position and directed the Hood's opening fire at the wrong target. The error was corrected within minutes, but those minutes mattered. At 05:52, Holland gave the order to open fire, and the Hood's forward turrets erupted with a blast of flame and smoke that could be seen for miles across the open water. The Prince of Wales opened fire almost simultaneously, the forward turrets joining the barrage, despite the ongoing mechanical problems that would plague her throughout the engagement. The Bismarck's response
They're
was
opening
almost
fire, Admiral.
immediate.
Engage the enemy
Lutyens,
fleet.
who
All
had initially
batteries, rapid
hesitated to
salvo.
engage, his orders
Jawohl, Herr
emphasized
Admiral.
the importance of attacking convoys rather than fighting enemy warships, gave the order to return fire when it became clear that avoiding action was impossible.
Range discrepancy,
The
adjust bearing
Bismarck's gunnery
0.5
was
degrees port.
devastatingly effective
New target
from the
angle
very first
120.
salvos.
Solution
The fire
ready.
control team, working with the precision instruments and analog computers in the ship's armored fire control tower, calculated a firing solution with remarkable speed, and the 38-centimeter guns began sending shells downrange at the Hood with a rate and accuracy that shocked the British observers who survived to describe it. The Prince Eugen also opened fire, her 8-inch shells adding to the weight of metal converging on the 2 British ships. Within minutes, the Hood was hit by shells from the Prince Eugen that started a fire amidships, sending a bright glow of burning ready-use ammunition flickering along her boat deck. The fire was visible to watchers on both sides and added to the growing sense of crisis aboard the British flagship. What happened next remains one of the most analysed and debated moments in naval history. At approximately 6:01, with the range down to roughly 14,500 meters, the Hood was struck by a salvo from the Bismarck. What followed was a catastrophic explosion that tore the ship apart. Witnesses on the Prince of Wales and on the German ships described a sheet of flame that erupted from the Hood's midship section, rising hundreds of feet into the air, followed by a massive detonation that broke the ship in two. The bow and stern sections rose separately out of the water, hung for a moment at steep angles against the grey sky, and then slid beneath the surface. From the first flash of the explosion to the moment the last piece of wreckage disappeared, fewer than 3 minutes elapsed. Of the 4 18 men aboard HMS Hood, 3 survived. Ordinary signalman Ted Briggs, able seaman Robert Tilburn, and midshipman William John Dundas. They were pulled from the freezing water by the destroyer HMS Electra, and the stories they carried for the rest of their lives became the only first-hand testimony
straight through
of
the
what the
thin
destruction
deck
of the hood looked like from
detonating
inside the
precisely
ship.
in the after magazine.
The most widely accepted explanation for the hood's loss is that one or more shells from the Bismarck's fifth salvo penetrated the ship's relatively thin deck armor and reached one of the after magazines where the propellant charges for the 15-inch guns were stored. The detonation of several tons of cordite propellant in a confined space would have produced the kind of instantaneous, catastrophic explosion that witnesses describe, a blast so violent that it destroyed the structural integrity of the entire after section of the ship in a fraction of a second, allowing the sea to flood in so rapidly that there was no possibility of organized evacuation or damage control. The hood had carried the fatal vulnerability of inadequate deck armor for her entire career, and in the Denmark Strait, that vulnerability was finally and lethally exploited. The destruction of the hood sent a shockwave through the Royal Navy and through Britain itself that is difficult to overstate from a modern perspective. The hood was not just a warship. She was the most famous ship in the Royal Navy, perhaps the most famous warship in the world. She had spent the interwar years as the visible embodiment of British sea power, touring the globe on flag-showing cruises that took her to every major port in the Empire and beyond. Her image was on postcards. Her profile was instantly recognizable to millions of people who had never set foot on a warship, and her name carried an emotional weight that went far beyond her military capabilities. To lose her, and to lose her so quickly, so completely, with such an appalling death toll, was not just a military setback. It was a psychological blow that struck at the very heart of British national identity and the centuries-old assumption that the Royal Navy was the supreme fighting force on the world's oceans. The Admiralty's response was shaped as much by the need to avenge the hood and restore that shattered confidence as by the purely military necessity of preventing the Bismarck from reaching the convoy lanes. With the hood gone, the Prince of Wales found herself alone against both German ships, and her situation deteriorated rapidly. She had scored hits on the Bismarck. At least 2, possibly 3 shells struck the German battleship, one of which penetrated the bow area and ruptured fuel tanks, causing a serious oil leak and contaminating a significant portion of the ship's forward fuel supply. But the Prince of Wales was also taking punishment. The Bismarck and Prince Eugen concentrated their fire on her, and she was hit by multiple shells that caused significant damage to her bridge structure and wounded several officers, including her captain. Compounding the damage, the mechanical problems with her main armament reached a critical point. One of the quadruple turrets suffered a jam that took it out of action entirely, reducing her firepower
All
at the
engines
worst
ahead,
possible
slow.
moment.
Move!
Captain John Leach made the difficult but correct decision to disengage, laying a smokescreen and turning away to open the range before his ship suffered the same fate as the hood. It was a decision that would later be questioned by armchair critics, but endorsed by almost every professional naval officer who examined the circumstances. The Prince of Wales was outgunned, malfunctioning, and alone, and continuing the engagement would most likely have resulted in her destruction. Without significantly damaging the Bismarck, but the hits the Prince of Wales had scored on the Bismarck would prove
1000
far
Tonnen
more
verloren, Herr
consequential
Kapitän.
than anyone on either side realized at the time.
Wir können
The
uns
shell
nicht auf
that
die
struck the
vorderen
bow
Tanks
and
verlassen.
ruptured the forward fuel tanks created a problem that would shape every decision Lutyens made for the remainder of the voyage. The Bismarck was now trailing a visible oil slick that could be followed by pursuing ships and spotted by aircraft. And she had lost access to approximately 1,000 tons of fuel oil, enough to significantly reduce her operational range and eliminate the comfortable margin that would have allowed extended operations in the mid-Atlantic. Lutyens faced a choice that would define the outcome of the entire operation. He could press on into the Atlantic with reduced fuel, hoping to refuel from one of the supply ships the Kriegsmarine had pre-positioned along the convoy routes. He could reverse course and attempt to return to Norway through the same passages he had used to break out. Or he could head for the French Atlantic coast, the ports of Brest or Saint-Nazaire, where German forces were already established and where repair facilities, fuel and air cover from Luftwaffe bases would be available. Each option carried risks, and the clock was ticking with every nautical mile. Lutyens made his decision on the evening of May 24th. He would detach the Prinz Eugen to operate independently against convoys. The heavy cruiser's fuel situation was better, and she could still carry out the raiding mission that was the operation's original purpose, while the Bismarck headed southeast toward the French coast. It was a rational decision given the fuel situation and the damage to the bow, but it meant abandoning the strategic objective of the entire operation. The Bismarck was no longer a raider hunting for convoys. She was a damaged ship running from port, and every ship the Royal Navy could muster was hunting her. The question was whether the British could maintain contact long enough to bring overwhelming force to bear, or whether the Bismarck could disappear into the vastness of the Atlantic and reach the safety of French waters before she was caught. For the next several hours, the cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk maintained radar and visual contact with the Bismarck as she steamed southeast. The shadowing was tense. Dangerous work. The cruisers had to stay close enough to keep the Bismarck on their radar screens while staying far enough away to avoid her main guns, which could reach them at ranges well beyond their own ability to fight back.
Confirm, sir, 5-9er.
The Suffolk in particular played a crucial role.
Herr Kaloi, wir werden geortet. Die Suffolk peilt uns kontinuierlich an. Verstanden? Melden Sie jede Änderung.
To plot an interception course, but maintaining contact in the North Atlantic at night, in variable weather and visibility, with a target that was actively trying to evade, was a task that pushed the limits of 1941 radar technology. The Bismarck's crew knew they were being shadowed. The emissions from the British radar sets were detectable by the Bismarck's own electronic receivers, and Lutyens used the darkness and the weather to attempt evasive maneuvers designed to break the radar track. The first major attempt to slow the Bismarck before she could escape came from an unexpected direction. Admiral Tovey ordered the carrier HMS Victorious, which was accompanying his force, to launch a torpedo strike against the Bismarck, despite the appalling conditions, high seas, fading light, and the fact that many of the Swordfish torpedo bomber crews aboard Victorious were so inexperienced that some had never made a deck landing at night before. The Swordfish was an aircraft that looked as if it belonged to the previous war, a fabric-covered biplane with an open cockpit, a maximum speed of barely 140 miles per hour, and a crew of 3 who sat exposed to the elements in conditions that defied belief. But the Swordfish had qualities that more modern aircraft lacked. It could fly slowly enough to aim its torpedo with precision. Its fabric-covered structure was so flimsy that many anti-aircraft shells passed straight through without detonating their fuses, which were designed to trigger on the impact with a metal skin. And its crews possessed a brand of stubborn courage that remains extraordinary even by the standards of a war that demanded extraordinary things from everyone who fought it. 9 Swordfish launched from Victorious into the gathering darkness of the evening of May 24th, navigating by dead reckoning across miles of open ocean toward a target they could barely see. They found the Bismarck, attacked through a storm of anti-aircraft fire.
We've lost her. How could we have lost her?
And scored a single torpedo hit on the ship's armored belt amidships.
Find her.
The hit did no significant damage. The Bismarck's torpedo defense system, a multi-layered arrangement of armored bulkheads and void spaces designed to absorb the explosive force of a torpedo detonation before it reached the ship's vitals, worked exactly as intended. The warhead detonated against the outer hull. The blast energy was dissipated through the successive layers of the defense system, and the inner hull remained intact. It was a testament to the quality of the Bismarck's construction and a sobering demonstration of how difficult it would be to stop her with the weapons available. All 9 Swordfish survived the attack and returned to Victorious, some landing in conditions so hazardous that their survival was as remarkable as the attack itself. Then, in the early hours of May 25th, the worst possible thing happened from the British perspective. They lost contact. The precise sequence of events is still debated, but the result was unambiguous. The Bismarck, taking advantage of darkness, deteriorating weather, and a course change that caught the shadowing cruisers off guard, slipped away from the radar screens of Suffolk and Norfolk and vanished into the Atlantic. For the next 31 hours, the Royal Navy had no idea where the most dangerous warship in the German fleet was. The psychological impact of this disappearance was immense. Every convoy at sea, every troop transport, every tanker carrying the fuel that kept Britain's war machine running, was potentially within reach of the Bismarck's guns. Without knowing where she was, the Admiralty could not concentrate forces against her or route convoys away from her path. The hunt was no longer a tactical pursuit, it was a strategic crisis. Admiral Tovey faced an agonizing dilemma during those lost
Bogey
hours.
sighted, bearing 270.
His own flagship, King
like a
George
carrier
V,
group.
was consuming
Requesting
fuel at
immediate
a rate that
confirmation
would
and
soon
backup.
force him to break off
Right, gentlemen,
and
this is
head
it.
for port
She's here.
unless
Grid reference
contact was
49er.
regained.
I want every available destroyer
The other
converting by
British ships
0800
searching the
hours. Move
Atlantic
those
were in
markers
similar
now.
situations. Destroyers, with their relatively small fuel bunkers and high consumption at speed, were particularly pressed. If the Bismarck had turned west into the mid-Atlantic, she could be anywhere within a circle of ocean hundreds of miles across, and the chances of finding her by visual search alone in that vastness were effectively zero. If she had turned north to head back to Norway, she might already be beyond interception. The one scenario that offered the British a chance was if Lutyens had continued southeast toward France.
Get her up quickly now!
Because that
Watch
would
the
take
wind!
the Bismarck within range of aircraft, operating from bases in
Next
Northern
one ready!
Ireland, and from the carrier HMS Ark Royal, which was part of Force H under Admiral James Somerville, steaming north from Gibraltar to join the hunt. The break came from two sources almost simultaneously. First, Lutyens made a critical error. At approximately 09:00
Magnetic triggers are
on
failing,
May
sir.
25th,
They're hitting the targets,
he
but not
transmitted
exploding.
a lengthy
Right.
radio
We can't risk
signal
another
to
dud
Kriegsmarine
run.
headquarters
Change the
in
detonators to
Germany.
contact type
A
immediately.
detailed situation report that lasted long enough for British direction-finding stations to obtain a fix on the transmission. The fix was not precise. Direction finding in the North Atlantic was subject to significant errors at long range, but it was enough to establish that the Bismarck was southeast of the last known position, heading in the general direction of the French coast. The Admiralty initially plotted the fix incorrectly, placing the Bismarck further north than she actually was, which sent Tovey's forces temporarily in the wrong direction. But the error was eventually recognized and corrected, and the pursuit swung back onto the right bearing. The second and decisive piece of intelligence came from the enemy. On the morning of May 26th, a consolidated Catalina flying boat of RAF Coastal Command, operating from a base in Northern Ireland on an extended patrol over the eastern Atlantic, sighted the Bismarck through a break in the clouds.
Das Ruder reagiert nicht.
The
Volle
aircraft,
Kraft
designated
Steuerbord, aber wir
Catalina
drehen nach
Z of
Backbord.
209
Halten Sie den
Squadron,
Kurs.
was
Melden
at
Sie
the
den
extreme
Schaden an die
limit of its patrol
Maschinenleitung.
range, and the
Mehr
sighting was
Drehzahl,
as much a matter
Backbord!
of luck as
Sofort!
skill.
Es geht nicht, Herr
The
Ingenieur.
Atlantic
Wir
is an
verlieren
enormous
Druck.
body of
Die
water,
Ruder!
and finding
Sie
a single
reagieren
ship in
nicht.
it, even a ship the size of the Bismarck, required the aircraft to be in precisely the right place at precisely the right moment. The co-pilot in the cockpit at the moment of sighting was Ensign Leonard B. Smith of the United States Navy, one of several American military personnel who were quietly serving alongside British forces months before the United States officially entered the war, a detail that remained classified for years afterward. The Catalina's report electrified the Admiralty. The Bismarck was approximately 690 nautical miles from Brest,
All engines ahead,
steaming at
flank.
a speed that would bring
Stand
her
by
within
the
range
tubes.
of Luftwaffe
Fire
air
when
cover
ready.
from French bases within a day. If she was to be stopped, it had to be done now, and the only force close enough to do it was Force H, specifically the Swordfish torpedo bombers aboard HMS Ark. The Ark Royal was one of the most famous carriers in the Royal Navy, a ship that had already survived being falsely reported as sunk by German propaganda, and that carried an air group whose experience and skill were among the best in the fleet. But the conditions on May 26th were atrocious. The Ark Royal was steaming into heavy seas that caused her flight deck to pitch
The ship would
through
continue
arcs
to
of over
resist
50
until
feet.
ammunition was
Waves were
exhausted.
breaking over the bow, and the wind was gusting to gale force. Launching and recovering aircraft in these conditions was dangerous under any circumstances. But for Swordfish biplanes loaded with torpedoes,
Hier, nimm
it was
das.
an exercise in
Wir werden es
controlled
brauchen.
insanity.
Danke, Maat.
The first
Wir haben uns
strike,
eingekesselt.
launched from the Ark
Es gibt
Royal
kein
that
Entrinnen
afternoon,
mehr.
nearly ended in disaster.
Fürchte dich
The
nicht,
Swordfish found
denn
a
ich
ship
bin
through the
mit dir.
clouds and attacked it,
Empfangt
only
seinen
to
Segen.
discover at the last
Amen.
moment that their target was not the Bismarck, but
Dicht.
the British cruiser
Nächste
HMS
Luke.
Sheffield, which
Schnell.
had been sent ahead to shadow the German battleship. The torpedoes, equipped with a new type of magnetic detonator, either detonated prematurely on hitting the water or malfunctioned completely, and Sheffield emerged undamaged but shaken. The failed attack was a humiliation, but it had one silver lining. For the second strike, the magnetic detonators were replaced replaced with the older, more reliable contact detonators that required a direct physical hit on the target's hull to trigger. The second strike launched at approximately 19:10 on the evening of May 26th, 15 swordfish climbing away from the pitching deck of the Ark Royal and heading into wind, rain and low cloud toward the last reported position of the Bismarck. They found her, and what followed was one of the most consequential torpedo attacks in the history of naval warfare. The swordfish attacked in small groups, approaching from different directions to divide the Bismarck's anti-aircraft fire, and they pressed their attacks with a courage that defied rational calculation. Flying at barely 100 feet above the wave tops, into the teeth of a barrage that filled the air with tracer and shell fragments, aiming their torpedoes at a ship that was maneuvering violently to avoid them. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft defenses, formidable on paper, proved less effective than expected
Reichweite
against the slow-moving
23.000.
biplanes.
Laden
The
Sie
fire
die
control
Granaten!
predictors, designed to track faster modern aircraft,
Achtung!
had
Feuer!
difficulty calculating deflection for targets moving at under 100 knots, and the swordfish's fabric structure continued to let shells pass through without triggering their fuses. 2 torpedoes hit the Bismarck. One struck the armored belt amidships, where the torpedo defense system once again absorbed the damage without significant effect. But the second torpedo struck the stern near the ship's rudder. That single torpedo hit changed everything. The warhead detonated against the Bismarck's stern structure, and the blast effect jammed the ship's rudder at an angle of approximately 12 degrees to port. The damage was not to the ship's engines or her ability to generate power. The Bismarck's 3 propellers and their turbines continued to function, but
We
to
must
her
sink her
ability to
now
steer.
before she reaches the
With the
escorts.
rudder jammed hard over, the ship was forced into a continuous turn to port that no amount of engine manipulation could correct. The crew tried everything, running the port and starboard engines at different speeds, attempting to use the propellers as makeshift rudders by varying their thrust asymmetrically. Divers went over the stern in the freezing, turbulent water to try to free the jammed rudder, or to cut it away with underwater torches, but the sea conditions made it impossible to work, and the damage proved to be structural rather than mechanical. The torpedo blast had deformed the rudder post and the surrounding stern frame to the point where no repair was possible with the tools and facilities available at sea. The Bismarck, still capable of making nearly 30 knots, was trapped in a slow circle in the open Atlantic, unable to steer for France, unable to escape, unable to do anything but wait for the British fleet to arrive. What followed during the night of May 26-27 was among the most harrowing experiences endured by any warship crew in the Second World War. The Bismarck, locked in her crippled turn, was found and attacked by British destroyers. The 4th Destroyer Flotilla, under Captain Philip Villa, comprising HMS Cossack, Maori, Sikh, Zulu, and the Polish destroyer ORP Piorun.
Steady now,
The
easy
destroyers
does it.
attacked with torpedoes
We have the
throughout
last
the
one
night,
secured.
darting in and out of the darkness, illuminating the Bismarck with searchlights and star shells, firing their torpedoes at close range, and then turning away into the blackness before the battleship's massive guns could find them. The Bismarck fired back with her main and secondary armament, the muzzle flashes of her 38-centimeter guns lighting up the night in volcanic eruptions of orange flame. But hitting fast-moving destroyers in darkness and heavy seas was a task beyond even the
Es gibt
Bismarck's
keine Überlebenden,
sophisticated
meldet die
fire control.
Marineleitung. Das
And
ist
no
eine
destroyer was
Katastrophe
hit.
für die Moral.
Whether
Wir
any of
müssen
the
uns neu
destroyer
aufstellen,
torpedoes struck the
sofort.
Bismarck is still debated. Some claimed hits, but if any torpedoes did connect, they caused no additional critical damage. The real effect of the night attacks was psychological. The Bismarck's crew had been at action stations almost continuously since the Battle of the Denmark Strait 3 days earlier. They were exhausted. Many were suffering from the effects of concussion and noise exposure, and all of them understood what the sunrise would bring. The destroyer's attacks ensured that there would be no rest before the final reckoning. Aboard the Bismarck, the mood during that last night shifted from determination to something approaching resigned fatalism. Lutyens sent a signal to Hitler personally, stating that the ship would fight to the last shell. The message was not bravado. It was a factual assessment of the situation. With the rudder jammed and no possibility of reaching port, the Bismarck's crew knew that their only remaining option was to fight until the ship was destroyed, or until she could no longer fire her guns. Some men wrote final letters that they placed in waterproof containers, hoping they might be found. Others gathered in small groups to talk, to share what food was available, to say the things that men say when they know they are unlikely to see another sunset. The ship's chaplain held a service. The damage control teams checked and rechecked the watertight doors and escape routes, knowing that when the shooting started in the morning, the difference between reaching the upper deck and being trapped below could be measured in seconds. Dawn on May 27, 1941, broke grey and heavy over the North Atlantic. The sea was rough, the wind was strong from the northwest, and the visibility was variable, good enough to see several miles in clear patches, reduced to less than a mile when rain squalls swept across the surface. The Bismarck, still circling slowly, was approximately 300 nautical miles west of Brest. Closing from the northwest were the battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers, the combined force representing the concentrated striking power of the Royal Navy's home fleet. The Rodney was a ship of particular significance in this context. She carried 9 16-inch guns,
instantaneous.
the largest afloat in the Royal Navy.
The Bismarck's failure
Weapons
to press
that
the
fired
advantage
shells
proved
weighing over a
equally
ton
decisive.
to ranges that matched or exceeded the Bismarck's own guns. King George V, Tovey's flagship, carried 10 14-inch guns in the same mixed turret arrangement as the Prince of Wales. Together, the two British battleships could deliver a combined broadside that dwarfed what the Bismarck could fire in return. And unlike the situation in the Denmark Strait, the British would be engaging with their full armament from the outset, at ranges where their superiority in numbers would be decisive. The engagement began at approximately 08:47, when the Rodney opened fire at a range of roughly 23,000 meters. King George V opened fire 1 minute later. The Bismarck replied almost immediately, her forward turret sending salvos toward the Rodney with the same precision that had destroyed the Hood 3 days earlier. The initial gunnery from the Bismarck was good. Her third salvo straddled the Rodney, meaning that shells fell on both sides of the target, indicating that the next salvo adjustment could produce a hit. But the Bismarck's gunnery advantage
The Bismarck is
lasted
moving
only
southwest
minutes.
towards Brest.
The combined
If we
fire
don't
of the two
intercept her
British
here, we must
battleships,
sink the Bismarck.
supplemented
I
by the
repeat, you
8-inch
must
guns
sink
of
that
the
ship.
heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk firing from the north, quickly found the range and began to score hits. The effect was cumulative and devastating. At approximately 09:02, a 16-inch shell from Rodney struck the Bismarck's forward superstructure, destroying the main fire control director and killing most of the gunnery team inside it. With the centralized fire control knocked out, each turret was forced to fire independently using its own local rangefinders and manual calculations, a far less accurate method that reduced the Bismarck's already declining chance of scoring effective hits. What followed over the next 90 minutes was not so much a battle as a systematic demolition. The Bismarck, trapped by her jammed rudder, unable to maneuver, unable to evade, and with her fire control progressively destroyed, became a target that the British ships could engage at ranges that made missing difficult. The volume of fire directed at the Bismarck during the final engagement was staggering. Rodney alone fired approximately 380 16-inch and 716 6-inch shells during the action. King George V added hundreds more 14-inch rounds. Norfolk and the heavy cruiser Dorsetshire contributed with 8-inch gunfire and torpedoes. The effect of this concentrated bombardment was visible and terrible. One by one, the Bismarck's turrets were knocked out. Bruno was destroyed early in the action. Anton fell silent soon after, and the after turrets followed as shells penetrated their barbettes and jammed their training mechanisms. The superstructure was reduced to a tangle of twisted steel. The upper work swept clean by blast and fragmentation, fires burning in dozens of locations from the bow to the stern. From the decks of the British ships, the Bismarck appeared to be a floating inferno, her hull still intact, but everything above the main deck systematically destroyed.
Die äußere Hülle wurde durchschlagen, aber die Zitadelle hielt stand. Ja, Herr Doktor. Die Berichte bestätigen die Wirksamkeit. Das müssen wir für die H-Klasse übernehmen.
Despite absorbing hundreds of shells, estimates range from 300 to over 400 hits of various calibers.
The analysis validated the Bismarck's protection. The meticulous German engineering of the Krupp armor surpassed Allied equivalents in several key metrics.
The hull remained structurally intact below the waterline, and the ship stubbornly refused to go under. The British battleships, their own ammunition running low and fuel levels becoming critical, found themselves in the surreal position of having reduced the most powerful battleship in the German Navy to a lone, silent wreck, but being unable to send her to the bottom with gunfire. Admiral Tovey ordered the cruiser HMS Dorsetshire to close and finish the Bismarck with torpedoes. Dorsetshire fired 3 torpedoes, 2 into the starboard side and 1 into the port side, and at approximately 10:40 on the morning of May 27, 1941,
the signal logs clearly indicate the scuttling command was received, but the underwater surveys showed torpedo damage inconsistent with the scuttling theory,
and opened seams rather than to the shell fire that had destroyed everything above the waterline. She went down stern first, her bow rising briefly above the surface as the stern section flooded, and then she was gone, sliding beneath the waves in a position approximately 48 degrees 10 minutes north, 16 degrees 12 minutes west, nearly 600 miles west of the French coast. There is an important and unresolved question about whether the Bismarck was ultimately sunk by British torpedoes or by her own crew's scuttling charges. Survivors from the Bismarck consistently stated after the war that orders were given to open the seacocks and set scuttling charges before the ship went down, a deliberate act of self-destruction intended to prevent the British from capturing the vessel, or claiming that their weapons alone had destroyed it. British analysis of the wreckage and the ship's final movements has not produced a definitive answer, and when the wreck was surveyed on the ocean floor in the 1980s, and again in 2002, the hull appeared to be largely intact below the waterline, which some have interpreted as evidence that the torpedo damage was less extensive than the British believed, and that scuttling played a significant role in the ship's loss. The truth almost certainly lies somewhere in the middle. The cumulative effect of torpedo damage, open seams from near misses, and the scuttling measures taken by the crew all contributed to the flooding that finally overwhelmed the ship's buoyancy. Whether the Bismarck would have sunk without the scuttling charges, or whether she would have eventually foundered from the torpedo damage alone, is a question that the evidence cannot conclusively answer. The aftermath of the sinking was marked by a scene of human tragedy that haunts the story to this day. As the Bismarck went down, hundreds of men who had survived the battle found themselves in the water, clinging to wreckage, floating in life jackets, struggling against the cold and the waves. The heavy cruiser Dorsetshire and the destroyer Maori stopped to rescue survivors, lowering ropes, nets, and scrambling lines over their sides as sailors reached down to pull exhausted men from the sea. Approximately 110 men had been pulled aboard the 2 ships when a lookout on Dorsetshire reported a possible submarine contact. Whether the contact was real, a U-boat stalking the British ships, or a false alarm has been debated ever since, but the response was immediate and irreversible. The commanding officer of Dorsetshire, Captain Benjamin Martin, ordered both ships to get underway at full speed, an order that meant abandoning the hundreds of men still in the water to their fate. The men clinging to the ropes alongside Dorsetshire's hull were torn away as the ship gathered speed, their cries carrying across the water to those already rescued and standing on the deck. A handful more were later picked up by U-74 and the German weather ship Sachsenwald, bringing the total number of survivors to approximately 115 out of a crew of over 200. More than 200 men perished, either killed during the battle, drowned when the ship sank, or died of exposure in the North Atlantic waters after the rescue ships departed. The loss of the Bismarck had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical result. For the Royal Navy, the victory was real but purchased at an extraordinarily high price. Not just the loss of the Hood and her crew, but the diversion of dozens of warships from convoy protection and other duties during the days of the pursuit, which left several Atlantic convoys without adequate escort and exposed to U-boat attack during one of the most critical periods of the Battle of the Atlantic. For the Kriegsmarine, the loss was catastrophic in a strategic sense that went beyond the destruction of a single ship, however powerful. The Bismarck's fate demonstrated conclusively that a surface raider operating alone in the Atlantic could be found, tracked, and destroyed by the combination of radar, air reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and overwhelming naval superiority that the British could bring to bear. Admiral Raeder's strategy of using capital ships as commerce raiders, the strategy that had justified the Bismarck's construction in the first place, was discredited overnight, and Hitler, who had been personally invested in the Bismarck and who was shocked by her loss, became increasingly reluctant to risk his remaining capital ships in operations where they might meet a similar fate. The most immediate consequence was the fate of the Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz. Completed and commissioned in early 1941, the Tirpitz was in most respects identical to the Bismarck. The same dimensions, the same armament, the same armor, the same speed. She was potentially an even more dangerous raider than the Bismarck, because lessons learned from the Bismarck's construction had been incorporated into small improvements in her design. But the Tirpitz never made a single Atlantic sortie. Instead, she spent her entire operational career in the fjords of northern Norway, her mere presence there tying down a disproportionate share of the Royal Navy's heavy forces in the home fleet, which had to maintain enough capital ships at Scapa Flow to counter the Tirpitz if she ever put to sea. In strategic terms, the Tirpitz arguably achieved more by staying in port than the Bismarck did by going to sea. Her existence as a fleet in being forced the British to maintain forces in the north that could have been deployed more productively elsewhere. But she never fired her main guns at an enemy warship, never attacked a convoy, and was eventually sunk by RAF bombers in a Norwegian fjord in November 1944, rolling over at her moorings after being hit by 5-ton tallboy bombs that tore open her hull. The most powerful sister of the most feared battleship in the German Navy ended her days as a stationary target, destroyed not by another warship, but by aircraft carrying weapons that her designers had never imagined. The story of the Bismarck also illuminated a larger truth about naval warfare that the most senior admirals on both sides were only beginning to grasp in 1941. The Bismarck was designed to fight other battleships. Her massive guns, her thick armor, her high speed, all of these were optimized for a form of warfare that had reached its zenith at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, and that was, even as the Bismarck was being built, rapidly becoming obsolete. The weapon that crippled the Bismarck and sealed her fate was not a battleship's guns, but a single torpedo launched from a canvas and wood biplane that could barely outrun the wind. The swordfish that jammed her rudder carried a weapon that cost a fraction of what a single 38-centimeter shell cost, was delivered by an aircraft that cost a fraction of what a single turret cost, and was launched from a carrier that displaced a fraction of the Bismarck's tonnage. The lesson was not lost on the naval strategists who studied the action in the months and years that followed. The age of the battleship as the supreme arbiter of naval power was ending, and the weapon that was ending it was the aircraft carrier and its aircrew. A truth that would be demonstrated even more dramatically 6 months later at Pearl Harbor and Taranto, and that would be confirmed beyond any doubt in the great carrier battles of the Pacific War. The Bismarck's wreck was located in 1989, resting on the side of an extinct underwater volcano at a depth of approximately 4,790 meters, nearly 3 miles below the surface of the Atlantic. The hull was found upright on the steep slope of the seamountain, remarkably intact given the violence of her final hours and the enormous pressures at that depth. The superstructure had been swept away, either during the sinking or during the long descent to the bottom.
The Bismarck was attempting to break out into the Atlantic to target these convoys here.
The armored citadel that had resisted hundreds of shells and multiple torpedoes was still recognizably the hull of the battleship. The turrets had fallen away during the sinking, pulled out of their barbettes by gravity as the ship rolled, and lie scattered on the seabed around the hull like discarded toys. The stern section, where the torpedo had jammed the rudder and sealed the ship's fate, showed the characteristic damage of the explosion, buckled and deformed plating, the rudder itself still visible and still jammed at the angle that had condemned 2,000 men. Subsequent expeditions, using remotely operated vehicles capable of operating at the extreme depths, have produced detailed surveys of the wreck.
Let's get a closer look at that
confirm
impact
many
point.
aspects of the survivors' accounts, while leaving the central question, scuttling versus sinking, as unresolved as ever. There is something about the Bismarck story that continues to fascinate in ways that go beyond the usual appeal of military history. Part of it is the compression of the narrative. The entire operational career of the most powerful battleship in the German fleet fits into 9 days, a time span so brief that it feels like the plot of a thriller rather than a real historical event. Part of it is the cast of characters: Lindemann, the meticulous captain; Lutyens, the fatalistic admiral; Tovey, the determined pursuer; the unknown swordfish pilot who launched the torpedo that changed everything. Part of it is the sheer scale of the response: an entire navy mobilized against a single ship, convoys left unprotected, forces pulled from the Mediterranean, the entire strategic balance of the Atlantic, temporarily distorted by the hunt for one vessel. But perhaps the deepest source of fascination is the way the Bismarck story crystallizes a moment of transition in the history of warfare. The moment when the weapon that had dominated the seas for centuries, the armored warship with heavy guns, was overtaken by something it could not effectively counter. The men who designed the Bismarck poured into her everything they knew about how to build a warship that could fight and survive in a gun duel with the most powerful ships afloat. They gave her the thickest armor, the most accurate guns, the most sophisticated fire control, the most redundant damage control systems that German engineering could produce. And in the Denmark Strait, against the hood, all of that worked exactly as intended. Bismarck's gunnery destroyed the pride of the Royal Navy in under 10 minutes of firing, a performance so devastating that it shocked both sides. But none of that, not the armor, not the guns, not the fire control, could protect the Bismarck against a torpedo dropped from a biplane flying at 80 knots. The torpedo did not need to penetrate 300 millimeters of Krupp cemented armor. It did not need to defeat a sophisticated fire control system. It simply needed to reach the one part of the ship that was not and could not be adequately armored, the rudder and steering gear that hung exposed beneath the stern, protected by nothing more than the ship's hull plating. The mightiest warship in the German fleet was brought to a halt by a weapon that struck her at her most vulnerable point, and no amount of armor or firepower could compensate for that single, fatal weakness. Consider what it means that the Royal Navy committed the equivalent of a small national fleet to the hunt for one ship. At various points during the pursuit, the forces searching for the Bismarck included 2 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 2 battle cruisers, more than a dozen cruisers, and upwards of 20 destroyers, along with maritime patrol aircraft flying from bases across the North Atlantic. This was not a proportionate response to a single warship, even one as powerful as the Bismarck. It was the response of an institution that understood, at a level deeper than tactical calculation, that allowing the Bismarck to operate freely in the Atlantic would undermine the foundation of everything the Royal Navy existed to protect. Britain's survival in 1941 depended on the Atlantic convoys, the ships that brought food, fuel, raw materials, and eventually the troops and equipment that would be needed to liberate Western Europe. If the Bismarck had reached the convoy lanes and begun destroying escorts and merchantmen, the effect on morale and on the material flow across the Atlantic would have been severe enough to alter the course of the war. The hunt for the Bismarck was not just a military operation. It was an act of strategic self-preservation by a nation that knew, with cold clarity, what it stood to lose. The human dimension of the Bismarck story is perhaps its most enduring element. On both sides, the men who fought in the Denmark Strait and in the final battle were not abstractions or statistics, but individuals with families, histories, fears, and hopes that extended far beyond the steel walls of their ships. The 3 survivors of the Hood, Briggs, Tilburn, and Dundas, carried the weight of 415 lost shipmates for the rest of their lives, a burden that shaped everything they experienced afterward. The approximately 115 survivors of the Bismarck returned to a Germany that was already descending into the catastrophe that would consume the next 4 years, and many of them spent the remainder of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. The thousands who did not survive, the men who went down with the Hood in those 3 terrible minutes, the men who died in the firestorm that consumed the Bismarck's superstructure, the men who were left in the water when the Dorsetshire pulled away, existed as individual human beings with complete lives and inner worlds, not as numbers in a casualty report. If there is a single thought that the Bismarck story should leave with anyone who encounters it, it is the recognition that behind every statistic of naval warfare stands a person who was as real and as irreplaceable as anyone alive today. The shipbuilding philosophy that produced the Bismarck did not die with her. The lessons learned from her construction,
the Citadel concept is sound, but the deck armor proved insufficient.
By every
we must
major
reinforce
navy in
the
world,
plating above the
and
magazines
they influenced
immediately.
warship design for years afterward. The effectiveness of her armored Citadel, which resisted penetration even under sustained fire from the heaviest guns the Royal Navy possessed, validated the German approach to protection and led to refinements in armor design that were incorporated into post-war warships of several nations.
Critical.
The failure
Even
of her
with the increased
anti-aircraft
plating,
defenses against
the
slow,
rudder
low-flying
housing is
aircraft
exposed.
led to a fundamental rethinking of anti-aircraft gunnery that prioritized volume of fire and rapid target tracking over the accuracy of individual shots. The vulnerability of her rudder and steering gear led to design changes in subsequent warships that sought to provide better protection for these critical systems. Although the fundamental problem, that the stern of a ship is inherently difficult to armor without compromising performance, was never fully solved by any navy, and the broader strategic lesson that a capital ship operating alone in waters where the enemy has air superiority is fatally vulnerable, became one of the defining principles of naval warfare for the rest of the 20th century, influencing everything from carrier task force composition to the development of guided missile systems designed to keep aircraft at arm's length. The wreck of the Bismarck sits today in international waters, far from any coastline, in darkness and cold and crushing pressure that no human body could survive unprotected. She is a war grave, and she is treated as such by the international community. No artifacts have been removed from the wreck, and the site is accorded the respect due to a place where more than 2,000 men lost their lives. The debate over what exactly sank her, British torpedoes, her own scuttling charges, or some combination of both, continues among naval historians with no prospect of final resolution. And in some ways the ambiguity is fitting. The Bismarck was built to be unsinkable, and even in death, she resists easy categorization. Her story refusing to resolve into the simple narrative of either heroic last stand or decisive British victory that partisans on either side would prefer. She was both a ship that fought with extraordinary courage and skill, and a ship that was run down and destroyed by a navy that proved more resourceful, more persistent, and ultimately more powerful than even the finest single warship could resist. How do you think the Bismarck story would have changed if that single torpedo from the Swordfish had missed the rudder? Would the Bismarck have reached Brest, been repaired, and sorted again? Or would the Luftwaffe's umbrella over the French coast have simply delayed the inevitable reckoning with a Royal Navy?
Sir, she must be here, in the gap, moving west. We've lost contact. We must mobilize the home fleet immediately.
Leaves open, and the answer says as much about what you believe about the nature of warfare as it does about the specific facts of this engagement. The Bismarck spent 9 days at sea on her first and only operational voyage, and in those 9 days she destroyed the most famous ship in the Royal Navy, forced the mobilization of virtually the entire home fleet, disrupted convoy operations across the North Atlantic, and created a crisis of confidence that reached the highest levels of the British government before she was finally brought to bay and destroyed. No warship in history accomplished so much and existed for so short a time. She was conceived in the resentment born of a punitive peace treaty, designed by engineers who poured the best of German technical skill into her hull, crewed by men who knew they were sailing into danger, and destroyed by a combination of mechanical failure, tactical miscalculation, and the sheer dogged persistence of an enemy that could not afford to let her survive. Her story is not a celebration of warfare. It is a testament to the reality of what happens when nations pour their genius and their resources into building machines designed to destroy each other. Machines crewed by men who did not choose the circumstances that brought them to the North Atlantic in the spring of 1941, but who faced those circumstances with a courage that commands respect, regardless of which flag they served. The Bismarck lies on the floor of the Atlantic, and above her the convoys still cross, tankers, container ships, cruise liners following routes that would have been recognizable to the men who hunted and were hunted in those grey waters 85 years ago. The sea does not remember what happened on its surface in May of 1941, but we do, and as long as we do, the men who sailed and fought and died aboard the Bismarck and the Hood, and and all the other ships that converged on that patch of ocean will not be entirely forgotten. If this story stays with you, share it with someone who understands why the past is not just history, but the foundation of the world we live in right now. And if you want to keep exploring the moments that shaped our present, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.